Hi guys, this is part 4 of our tomato grow along. So today we're going to look at potting them on and the next stage for that, but we're also going to look at pest diseases and issues with the tomatoes as we grow them and things that we're going to do to avoid that as well. This is the tomato muscovich that we've been growing. So these are the ones that were started and popped into the pot straight away. So this is definitely ready for potting on. You can see the roots at the bottom are coming out and it's obviously doing very well. We've got some side shoots coming and also some flowers coming as well at this stage, and these have grown much quicker than all the others, and that's probably just the variety rather than anything else. They are ready to be planted out, but we're still having some really quite cold nights here, and although I have a heater in my polytunnel, I failed to put it on correctly last night, so I'm very glad that these are okay. So I'm not going to plant them out quite yet. And then this is one called Principe Borghese that we popped straight into the soil blocks from, and these are doing very well, and once again these are ready to plant out. Unlike the other ones, the ones in these very large soil blocks, which is the largest size that you can get, I am not going to be potting on, because they air prune and because that we feed them a little bit earlier when they're in soil blocks. They'll be absolutely fine, and it should hopefully only be like a couple of weeks before we get these in. The ones that I planted into the wall pot, so this is a variety called Juggo, are looking quite weak. They've got some little spots all over them showing a little bit of distress, but it seems to all be this variety, and the roots are starting to poke out, so they're obviously happy in the wall pots themselves. And then this is our little tumbling tom, which is a yellow variety that we also started in the tray and then have gone into soil blocks before they went into these pots, and that is what the roots are looking like at the moment. So they are definitely ready to be potted on. If I had the space, I could put them straight into hanging baskets and then keep them in the protection of a polytunnel. And then these are the ones that we sowed a few weeks ago now, might even be 4 weeks ago, I'm not sure, and they are ready to be potted up into the next size. And these ones I'm going to keep in soil blocks because that's just the easier way for me, and they've got a tiny little amount of roots on the bottom, and they're going to go into the mini 5 soil blocks where I can put them a little bit deeper. But they're looking pretty happy. They have had quite a slow growth. They're just starting to put on their true leaves now, so I think they'll be absolutely fine. Okay, so when it comes to potting these up, we are not going to be putting them into a massively bigger pot. We just want to go a little bit bigger so we can add some more food. So that's the difference in the pot size of these. It is not a huge amount. Could go a little bit bigger, that would be absolutely fine, but we don't necessarily need to go double the size, for example. So all I'm using here is a peat-free multi-purpose compost, nothing fancy. Just going to add a little bit into the bottom of the pot. It's probably about 1 inch. If your plants are leggy, we can still go deeper with these. That's what the roots are looking like at the moment. So they're not pot bound, but if you are worried about them, just loosen them up a little bit. And pop them in and then move that soil around the edge. These will probably be okay in here for another week, possibly 2, but these ones are growing really fast, so I think they're more likely to be another week. So firm it in, but don't firm it down too hard, and then we'll give that a bit of water, and remember to relabel. For any that have not really got many roots, I will leave these, and they'll probably be fine for another week or 2, but I'm going to keep a close eye on those. These are the tumbling tom varieties, so they do grow a little bit less ferocious than some of the others. So when you've got a plant that is really quite leggy like this one, you can see it's a lot of stem there. This is where the seed leaves were. Oh no, sorry, seed leaves were there, and it's obviously dropped a few leaves. That's probably just because it's been stressed being outside, and it's still got plenty of leaves on the top, so I'm not overly worried about it. But what we can do is lower it deep into a pot and then fill round as we would before, and the stem will put on some extra roots which will help give it a bit more stability and just keep it as good as possible. That's what that one looks like now. And have a look for any slugs and snails that are hiding in the bottom of your pots. This is what the tomatoes look like now, and where possible it is always worth trying to keep those plants separated so their leaves aren't touching, just because this can cause them to go leggy, which we don't want obviously. When watering our tomatoes, even at this early stage, it is best practice to either water them from the bottom or just water them around the soil, and making sure not to get those leaves wet, just to avoid things like that early blight. We started having some night temperatures that were looking a lot better, so I did start putting my tomatoes outside, although I will caution that I do have a heater in the tunnel that usually works fine. That's definitely human error. So if you do have a space, and we're looking for a minimum night temperature for them to be very safe and thrive of 10, and below 3 particularly, we have the risk of frost. So that's the point where I really make sure that they've got a thick cloth on them, maybe 2 or 3 layers. And I will also get the heater on at that point during the night, just because it's not worth losing them at this point. If you don't have the ability to do that, or the weather in your area is quite cold, so we've got a few 2s at nights coming up, so it is definitely going to be a matter of putting the heater on for a little bit longer, then keep them in the house. But otherwise you can start bringing them out into a protected space under cover outside. Next we're going to talk about our diseases and pests and issues with the tomato plants. I'm not going to go over them all because there are so many, and the chances are that you won't come across the majority of these, so I'm going to go across what I think personally is ones that I'm most aware of and that is most likely to happen in this environment. So the first one to think about is early blight. So early blight is a fungi that is in the soil and it is looking for a host plant in order to get its disease and its process under production. So what we need to do with this is avoid the soil jumping up when we water onto the underside of the leaves, because that is when we are most likely to encourage this onto the plant. It starts by looking like splotches on the leaves of a dark spots with a yellow ring around them, and early blight is less of an issue than late blight. So usually if we've got an early blight, we can manage this and keep the plants healthy and going for long enough in order to see out the season with them. So it's really about managing the plants that we put in and making sure that the leaves are not touching the soil. So if you are planting out a smaller plant, something like this, then I wouldn't be planting that deep. However, if I was planting out something like this one, what I would be doing is removing a couple of the leaves and then planting it deeper, but making sure that the leaf is not touching the compost. The other thing that we can do is also provide either an irrigation system, or we can provide things like plastic bottles that are cut in half with holes in the bottom and then water directly into this. And then we can also mulch our area where our tomatoes are, to just avoid that the water moving onto the leaves. We do always want to make sure that we leave enough leaves on the canopy at the top, so I wouldn't go beyond this stage of moving leaves. So we want two to 4 sets of leaves to make sure that the plant has enough chance to photosynthesize and continue to grow strongly. We want to keep these plants well watered but dry, so we're not going to come in with our hose pipes and actually water the leaves. Instead we're going to water into the containers or let the drip irrigation take care of that. Or with early blight, what we want to do is remove any signs of leaf damage as early as we find them, making sure that we keep those knives and those tools clean between moving from plant to plant to make sure that we don't spread it. Late blight is very similar, but it is actually an airborne fungus, so this can travel miles on the wind. If you're on an allotment site, it can only take one person's tomatoes to be affected, and then it will wipe out everybody's. It is also one that is part of the potato blight. This shows up as a wet, glossy blackness on the fruits, and also on the leaves you'll get that black spot as well, and within the stems, and it moves very, very fast. As soon as you spot late blight, it's really important that we move quickly by going in with a clean knife or a clean set of secateurs and removing any damaged leaves and fruit. But the chances are within the next 24 to 48 hours it's going to affect the rest of the plant, so keep a very close eye on it. And if it is moving, you're sure it's late blight, then what we're going to do is remove all of the fruits off of the plant, whether they are ripe or not, and then we're going to bring them in to continue ripening inside. And what you'll find is the ones that are affected by blight will still show up as they ripen. Tomatoes ripen from the inside out, so as they try to ripen you'll see that the skins are changing texture and it just doesn't look right. So at that point it becomes pretty obvious that they have been affected by blight, and then there is nothing more we can do except for chuck them away. Late blight needs living tissue to survive, but once you've had late blight in a bed, it is not a matter of changing the compost or anything like that, because it has to have a living plant to grow in. And although tomatoes are perennial, we grow them here as an annual, so it won't make a difference to our beds. There will be plenty of time between winter for it to have died down and not be causing any issues in the next season. So very similar to early blight, one of the things that we're going to do here is make sure there's plenty of airflow and that we prune the plants as often as needed to keep out as much of those lower leaves that could be starting to get a bit weaker as well. We're going to keep those leaves dry, so once again an irrigation system, or we're going to use the bottles buried in the ground, and we're going to be very careful as we water. This of course is more difficult if you're growing them outside, and outside you are very much more vulnerable to get late blight than you are if you're growing them under cover. But as I said, it also spreads really quickly and really easily, so if your outside ones have had late blight, then the chances are that you can very easily find it on your inside growing ones as well. Once again, we can mulch the bed, and we can also make sure that we're using clean tools as we move from plant to plant. And this isn't just if there is signs of disease, this is something to have as good practice at all times with the tomatoes. Next up is blossom end rot, and this is believed to be something that is caused by a calcium deficiency, but there is a lot of debate of whether that is truly the issue or whether something else is going on, and that's just a byproduct of it. It causes like a sunken area in the bottom end of the fruit where the blossom would have initially been, and it's very easy to see. There is no chance that you're going to miss it. You can cut off the bottom part of that fruit and still eat the top bit. This is more likely to happen if they're grown in containers, but sometimes if you can manage to give a larger container, then that's less likely to happen. So it can be to do with a watering schedule that's not been kept up to, can cause it as well. And the belief is that the calcium is not able to be absorbed by the plant, rather than there isn't calcium in the soil. You can buy calcium treatment for it, which may help. So if you've got a really bad case of it, then that is worth looking at. I've only ever had like 1 or 2 fruits that have done this, and the rest of the plant is absolutely fine. And then we have leaf mold. Now this can look very similar to late blight. It's also airborne. It usually affects most undercover crops. It shows by a yellow blotches on the upper leaves and then black mold on the lower leaves. Tends to affect the lower leaves of the plant first, so we want to make sure that we remove them as and when we see them. The worst thing with this is it will reduce the yield that you're going to have. So things that we want to do is very much the same as blight, so we're going to provide ventilation, make sure that we're trimming down the leaves and removing side shoots as needed, and we'll go through that as the grow along goes on. I'll show you how I do it. We also want to keep those leaves dry. We want to keep the soil moist as well to make sure that we don't have any periods of times when it's really dry. If you do have an issue with this, it's really important that we clean the greenhouse thoroughly between the seasons as well. Another thing that often causes a lot of issues is fruit splitting. So this is caused when the ground is very dry and we haven't kept up with watering, and then there's a sudden downpour or that we suddenly water that area. And basically the skin doesn't grow as quick as the rest of the flesh and it just splits out. It doesn't mean it can't be eaten, but you will want to either eat them sooner or pop them in the freezer if you're doing that, because they will very quickly grow a little bit of mould along that split. So to avoid this, we're just going to make sure that we keep constant water on them, and we do that every few days. So we don't want to completely saturate them, but we do want to keep that soil a little bit moist for them. This obviously, once again, is going to be really difficult when you're growing outside, but what you can do is make sure that that ground doesn't get too dry. But what you can't do is stop it getting completely soggy when there is a downpour. So you may still find that you have an issue with this, even if you are very careful and you do everything you can. So next we're going to talk about pests, and mice and rats can definitely be an issue, and what I find that they do is any low hanging fruit, particularly on like hanging basket varieties that are in my raised bed, they will just nibble the bottom out of those. So just remove those fruits and discard of them, pop them into your compost bin. Slugs and snails normally don't cause an issue past the seedling stage and the younger growth, and then after that I find that they leave them alone. Spider mites can be an issue, and this will depend on the weather as well, but it can cause a yellowing of the leaf, and they can also munch on the leaves. They are absolutely tiny, and you'll find that there's like a web across the leaf that can be really difficult to spot. So what we need to do with these is keep the plants clean and well maintained. You can also use a cayenne pepper and a garlic spray, which can just help deter them from wanting to be on the plant. If you have a really bad issue with it, then what we want to do is remove those plants that are causing the issue and get the area as clean as possible. We also can wetten the leaves of the tomatoes because they're not as happy in wetter climates and wetter spaces. So this is something that you'll usually find growing under cover. If we have a really dry period, then what we can do is add humidity to our polytunnel or our greenhouse. We can do this by wettening the floor and any hard areas, and they don't like that as much. That will need to be done regularly, every couple of hours, so if you're able to do that, that's great. Another way of keeping the greenhouse cool would be to add a shade covering, or if it were a greenhouse rather than a polytunnel, there's also shade paints and things like that. When it is really hot, I use old bed sheets that I just put over parts of the tunnel, and that works really well. So once again, it's really important to thoroughly clean our greenhouse or polytunnel over winter, just to make sure that there are none of these left behind. And that doesn't need to be done with any pesticides or any nasty products. Just a water and some scrubbing brushes, just gentle brushes, will do the job. But do get into every nook and cranny just to make sure that you are getting any that could be hiding, because obviously they are tiny and they will try and hang around if they can, and keep in the warmer environment over winter. And then the next option is to look at adding some natural predators. So there's lacewings, and then there's another one that I definitely cannot pronounce, so I'll pop that on the screen. Whitefly can also be an issue with our tomatoes. They are found in the hundreds, and they are little sucking insects that can cause quite a bit of damage. They cause issues with stunted growth, with yellowing of the leaves, and also they reduce our yields. Plants then become weak and more susceptible to other diseases as well. So things we can do to help with this is to put up the yellow sticky traps. And now I use these in the house, but I don't use them in the polytunnel, because they won't obviously just catch the whitefly, they're also going to catch your bees, your wasps, and other beneficial creatures. You can blast the bugs off of the plant. Of course, with every other issue, we try to keep the tomato leaves dry, so do this, but be very careful with doing it and try and make sure that they're going to dry. But I wouldn't do this at the height of a really hot day, because you might end up with the leaves burning a little bit. So do it on the duller evening or something like that, or first thing in the morning where it's got a chance to dry out. You can use soap wash. You can also use a garlic spray or a cayenne spray, and that will hopefully encourage any to move along. And then we can also introduce natural predators, and at this point this is going to be things like ladybirds and lacewings that are going to eat them for us. And hopefully that's something that you'll find will naturally move into your garden anyway. So companion plants that we can look at also for our tomatoes. So this would include marigolds, cress, chives, thyme and nasturtiums would be the main ones. And these help by having a scent that is going to put other pests off and bring in the beneficial creatures that we want in order to help with the pests as well. When it comes to supporting our plants, it's really important that we provide really good support, because actually these plants are heavy and they're very easy to break and snap. The fruit trusses can also be extremely heavy, so we might find that we need to offer them a string going from the main support in order to hold them up as well so they don't collapse. So I use baler twine in the polytunnel because it doesn't break. If you use something like a very thick version of garden twine, which is made of like a cotton or something like that, then what you'll find is at the base of the plant, because I bury mine, that it will rot. So if you do want to use something like that, you'd be looking at tying it above the plant on the stem rather than burying it underneath, and making sure that we don't water that and things like that, because they will snap very easily. I would personally avoid them and go for something that you can reuse, and I haven't found anything that isn't plastic, to be honest, which is a real shame. And if you have, please let me know. I tend to reuse my baler twine year after year, and it has been reused from the farmer originally. So it's another thing we can use is garden canes within a polytunnel or a greenhouse, making sure to support them at the top as well, because it's very easy for those to be knocked over, or for the plant's weight to pull them over. For outdoor use, then a really decent sized piece of wood knocked into the ground can help, or a piece of piping or something like that. You can also get tomato cages, which I haven't used, but I can imagine they are a little bit difficult, to be honest, and most plants go higher than that. But if you are growing a bush variety, so a determinate variety, then a tomato cage is probably going to give you enough support. If you have any ideas on how to support plants or things that you do that are different, then please do share photos and let everybody know, because the more we can share, the more it's going to help everybody else as well. So going into the next couple of weeks, if you want to be using things like this to water, and we'll cut it in half and use both ends, so we want one end per plant, then it'll be great to start collecting those. And then I use smaller bottles, so little personal size Coke bottles and things like that, into hanging baskets. So they are definitely worth starting to collect if you want to do that. There are also the tomato rings that you can buy, which go on top, and then they offer a reservoir for the water, so you don't have to once again get those tomato leaves wet. So if you've got those, they can be really helpful. If you are growing your tomatoes into grow bags, then I would suggest that you stack at least 2 grow bags up, because it's very difficult to get the depth in order to plant these deep enough. But also they run out of nutrients and get dry very quickly, so if you can manage to put 2 down, that would be really helpful. And I wouldn't plant more than 2 plants per grow bag length then, so 2 per 2 basically. I would also, if you can, put them with the bottoms cut to allow the roots to actually go down into the ground. So if you're not standing them onto a hard standing or a gravel or something like that, then allowing them to actually get to the nutrients below can be really beneficial. You will also want feeds for any tomatoes that are growing in pots or in grow bags and things like that, and any tomato feed will be fantastic for that, but we will want to make sure that we feed them regularly. If you're growing in a bed that's been well manured or been well fed, then I tend to find that I don't need to feed them as often as I would otherwise. I do, however, later in the season offer them a chicken manure pellet feed. That's easiest for me because I don't find it very easy to lift a watering can. So just to scatter some of those over and they'll just naturally get taken into the soil is much easier.